Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and I'm here to fulfill a Patreon request that I just got, which I know I said in the past that I would do Patreon requests and fulfill them in the order I usually get them, but this one I figured I could get done fairly quickly, and it's also kind of topical. So rest assured I'm working on the others, I promise you. I just wanted to do this one while it's still fresh. Now, the request I got was this person wanted me to respond to another YouTuber, one far bigger than I am, who goes by the name Despot of Antrim. He's one of those guys who has certainly been part of the culture war over the last little bit, but, you know, I have no strong feelings about him one way or the other. I've seen a couple of his videos, yes, including the really long ones. You know, he has his opinions, and they're certainly strong, but I really don't feel strongly about him one way or the other, like I said. In fact, had I just seen this particular thing that I'm going to respond to just on its own, and I didn't have a request to fulfill, I probably wouldn't have actually made a video responding at all. But it's a Patreon request, like I said. I'm being paid to respond, so a response I will give. And I'm going to make sure it's a measured one. So what am I responding to, you may be wondering? Well, in case you didn't know, Despot of Antrim recently released a list video of the worst films of 2024. Worst films, worst movies, you know the drill. People like to do that sort of thing at the end of the year. So specifically in the number 9 spot, he put Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, aka Godzilla X Kong, aka GXK. You know, I'm not even really that surprised. People have been hating on GXK since before GXK was even released. It's practically expected at this point. It certainly has its fans. I count myself as one of them. But seeing him put that on there isn't necessarily that surprising to me. I was asked to respond to it, however, and having watched the segment, I do feel that maybe Despot of Antrim didn't quite make his case as strongly as he thought he did. Now, he certainly made it very clear he doesn't like the movie. There's no doubt about that. But as to why he doesn't like it, that's a little less well-defined. In fact, I actually wondered if I would be able to respond to it, because a lot of what he says isn't very well defined. He doesn't quantify a lot of his arguments. He just sort of states things without quantifying them, because I guess he assumes that the reasons are self-evident. So if I were to have gone point by point through this segment, I probably would have been asking a lot of how, why, or saying, isn't that just your opinion and not a statement of fact? And, you know, that's not going to be much of a video. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of that happens. I can maybe focus on a couple of those things, but I don't see the point in going through all of them because, like I said, you can't really form much of a debate when the point is so ill-defined. And I get it. I want to make very clear, I get it. It's a list video. He's just giving a short segment about it. By definition, it's not going to be very in-depth. But it does leave me wondering, well, you'll see later on. It's very clear, though, he doesn't like it. And the closest we get to him possibly giving a deeper explanation is when he cites the reviews by the Movie Cynic and Little Platoon about GXK, the ones that go really in-depth about it. Although that's probably not the best idea, considering those reviews kind of got Godzilla fans riled up, not because they were hating on an enjoyable movie that the fandom liked, but rather because they had a lot of bad faith interpretations and outright inaccurate things that they were saying in order to try proving this movie is not just bad, but offensively bad. So, citing someone else's review to bolster your review isn't necessarily the best look anyway. When it's a review that is inaccurate, that's also not good. In fact, that's a little worse. But you know what? Like I said, he's got his own things he says, So I'm going to respond to some of those. Okay, so one particular point he made that basically gives a good demonstration of how ill-defined the points he makes are, and how he just kind of assumes the truth to be self-evident, is when he addresses our four main human characters. Those, of course, would be Dr. Eileen Adler, Gia, Trapper, and Bernie. What he says specifically, I might be paraphrasing a little bit here, but this is basically all he says. He says that Trapper is sexless and emasculated, Bernie is a Jar Jar Binksian stereotype, and both Eileen and Gia are Mary Sues. And that's where he leaves it. Like I said, doesn't really quantify anything. So that naturally is going to lead me to ask, why is he using those terms? He kind of quantifies the thing about Trapper being sexless and emasculated by saying it's part of the continuing Hollywood trend of emasculating men in general, which, you know, that has been a thing, certainly, but citing Trapper as the example, I think, is a little weird. Obviously, he's kind of the granola crunchy hippie type, and you can like that archetype or not, but the whole sexless thing, the movie's not about his sex life. The movie's not about his love life in any capacity. He's there, the role he plays is to be a kaiju vet at first, and then to do whatever the plot kind of needs him to do after that, which, you know, maybe that's not the best writing, I admit, but it's got nothing to do with how sexed or sexless he might be. So that feels like it kind of is a weird critique. If the movie's not about that, why would you bring it up and assign it as a critique of how the character is done? I also don't necessarily think there's anything specifically emasculating about him, but even if that were the case, we also have to remember Trapper's not the main character. Arguably, Kong is the main character of this movie, and he's kind of masculinity incarnate, right? He is, if he were a human character, he would be a barbarian. He would be a man's man with his weapon and his big muscles, just wandering through this untamed world, killing monsters, defeating bad guys. That's a pretty manly character. So to make an argument that the movie is part of the emasculating problem when a symbol of masculinity, and in fact King Kong has been a symbol of masculinity since the 30s, I mean, I don't know, I don't think that lines up. With Bernie, things are a little more complex and we need to bring some nuance into the conversation. Now, on the one hand, yes, there is precedence for the archetype of a scared black character and having that be depicted as a stereotype specifically. It used to be far more common in the olden days than it is today. Although, according to Despot, this is a modern day example. Is it though, really? After all, if we look at Bernie's character objectively, the fact that he is a black man, while obvious to anyone with a functioning set of eyes, isn't really the focus here. The focus is that he's a normal guy. He's been thrown into a crazy situation. Well, not just thrown in. He wanted to be part of it. He certainly wasn't prepared for it. And when confronted with all of this danger, you know, when it comes to something like being eaten by a tree, I think that's a perfectly normal response he has. Quick aside, Despot also says that Bernie provides a, well, that just happened moment in response to the man-eating tree. I disagree. A that just happened moment is supposed to be just sort of a flat delivery of sort of acknowledging something crazy happened and then moving on like it didn't happen. That's not how the scene, how the aftermath of the man-eating tree actually plays out. So, but that's not really the focus here. We're trying to determine if Bernie is a Jar Jar Binksian stereotype. Like I said, I think he's more meant to be just a normal guy in abnormal circumstances. But the comparison to Jar Jar Binks in particular, that I think is a bit exaggerated. Jar Jar, of course, has come to be rather infamous for bringing back, or at least sort of bringing back, certain black stereotypes and putting them all into this one character who technically is an alien, but certainly was... Well, it's hard to look at the character and not think he's supposed to kinda represent a black character when you take every particular aspect and put it all in one package. But the reason Jar Jar is considered a stereotype is not just because he acts silly. It's also because of all the other stereotypical things that somehow wound up in him. He's got a funny walk. He has terrible grammar when he tries to speak, and doesn't even really speak properly anyway. He's got exaggeratedly large ears and lips. His clothes are kind of shabby. All of this stuff comes together, and while I don't think George Lucas necessarily intended for him to be a black caricature, it does still make you wonder how all of this could happen. And nobody throughout the entire production of The Phantom Menace stopped to think if it might not come across well. But Jar Jar is a very extreme example, right? He's got all of those elements. How many of those elements does Bernie have? Other than being a scared character because of something scary happening, he doesn't really have those elements. And if we were to switch it around, if Bernie's character had been white instead of black and he were reacting the same way, there wouldn't be any question about racism, now would there? So, I don't necessarily think the idea of calling him a Jar Jar stereotype is accurate either. And as for Eileen and Gia being Mary Sues, well, the way I understand it, Mary Sues are not just flawless characters, but characters for whom the plot will bend and twist however it needs to in order to make sure that they are still considered the greatest things ever. Now, none of the human characters are necessarily that spectacular in GXK. If Eileen is kind of flat and doesn't have many prominent flaws, it's really because she's as one note as the other human characters. However, she does have a pretty severe conflict throughout the movie. She's trying to be a good mother, and she's facing the possibility that she might not actually be the right fit for Gia. You could say her flaw is that she's trying, but she doesn't quite know how to get all the right answers, and thus she's facing this conflict. Other than that, though, she doesn't really do anything all that spectacular. Anything that would make me think, oh, that was a huge contrivance that she shouldn't have been able to do. Therefore, she's a Mary Sue. What about Gia with her whole chosen one thing? Well, I mean, yes, she is given that place of special prominence. But then again, is it really that special? What exactly is her job here? Is she the one who's supposed to defeat Scar King and Shimo? Certainly not. Her job is to awaken Mothra so that Mothra can get Godzilla and Kong to work together to defeat Scar King and Shimo. Gia's an alarm clock. That's about it. I don't want to speak ill of the actress playing her or anything, but it's not really that spectacular of a role, especially for a chosen one character. So I don't see how the term Mary Sue fits. Is it supposed to be based on how when Gia's concerned that the visions she's getting mean there's something wrong with her, Eileen tells her, no, there's nothing wrong with you, you're perfect? Because that's a mother trying to calm her daughter, to get her through a difficult time. That's not meant to be taken literally, I don't think. So, see what I mean by when I say that these arguments aren't really quantified? So, I'm curious as to where he's getting them from. If I were to just respond to these things at face value, it would seem like the argument being made is that a woman is a Mary Sue simply for existing as a woman. A black character is a stereotype, and the worst possible kind of stereotype, simply if he is not taken 110% seriously, and a male character is an emasculated wimp unless we know exactly how many women he can bed whenever he wants. Again, that's how it seems if I just take it at face value. I don't necessarily want to say that that's what Despot of Antrim believes, because I don't know. But given the argument he states and the amount of backing up he does, I mean, again, taken at face value, it doesn't necessarily read that well. Something else Despot brings up at one point is that the movie is filled with tropes. And again, he uses this as a critique. It's a trope-filled movie, therefore the movie is bad because tropes are bad. That is a very common mistake that people make. A lot of people think that tropes are bad things, but they're not. Tropes are just commonly occurring things you see in different kinds of stories, and the reason they are so commonly used is because, well, for one thing, they work, and for another thing, that's how stories work. If you're telling a particular kind of story, you're eventually going to have to do something that has been kind of done before, something that is familiar, based on the structure of it. Not everybody can come up with something that's never been seen before just out of thin air. And those few people who are gifted enough to do so will eventually find that thing being imitated, and it becomes a trope as well. Tropes are not bad. Tropes are how stories are told. The way Despot uses the term, however, I think the word he meant was cliché. And yes, there is a difference. Why else would there be a different word if there were no difference? A cliché is a trope that's gone stale. A trope might be familiar, but you can do stuff with it. You can have plenty of variations. You can have it feel fresh somehow. A cliché doesn't have variation. It's the same every time you see it. People are bored with it. There's nothing new that's been done with it in a long time, so it's just considered, yeah, that would be considered a bad thing. To give a sort of generalized example, a trope is to have interpersonal conflict between two or more of your protagonists. Perhaps two characters, or three or four or five of them, all want the same goal, but they don't necessarily agree on how to achieve that goal. Or they want to be the one who achieves the goal and gets the glory over the others. So what's going to happen? How are they going to resolve that conflict? Will they prevent each other from getting to that goal? That's a trope. A cliché would be something like the liar reveal, where the characters learn that the protagonist has been lying in some way to them. In some manner he's been dishonest. They all turn their backs on him and want nothing to do with him anymore until they decide to forgive him and come back. You've seen it 1,000 times. It was only interesting the first time you saw it, and by the 50th time you were wondering why it's always the same thing. So, like I said, that is how a cliché works, and that is what makes a cliché different from a trope. Now, perhaps there is an interesting discussion to be had about how much of Godzilla Kong the New Empire is trope-based and how much is cliché-based, but that's not what this video is about. This video is responding to Despot of Antrim. Despot of Antrim says tropes are bad, but that's not a true statement. A trope is bad if it becomes a cliché, but if it's just a regular old trope, you can't very well write stories without them. While most of the arguments made, as mentioned, are not really delved into or expanded upon, there is one thing he did get specific about that really baffles me. It's when he critiques the movie because he doesn't think it makes sense that the Iwi, with their anti-gravity technology, wouldn't have conquered the entirety of the Hollow Earth and subjugated the monsters by that point. Instead, they're just staying in this one little pocket, just isolated from everything, hidden away. They haven't gone out and conquered everything, therefore that makes the movie bad. What? Okay, first and foremost, we gotta consider this movie not just on its own, but as part of the monsterverse. the 5th movie in the series, and the 2nd time we have seen a civilization of iwi, the first time being Kong Skull Island. The thing is, we learned back then that the iwi are not an imperialistic people. They are content with what they've got. They don't go out looking for more. They don't take from others. They live in relative harmony with nature. They're not the sort of civilization that's going to go out on a conquest. Even if they were, though, they still are kind of people who have a better understanding of the Titans in this universe than other humans do. And they know you don't mess with the monsters. That actually plays into one of the overarching themes of the universe, which is that mankind, no matter how advanced it might be, cannot defeat the Titans. Or, if they somehow manage to do so and defeat one Titan, there are consequences. When Kong Skull Island, Colonel Packard barbecues the Great Ape. That's when the Skull Devil rises up and is going to ransack the rest of the island, possibly moving beyond it. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. The army launches the Oxygen Destroyer against Godzilla and King Ghidorah. Godzilla is nearly dead, and believed to be dead, in fact. Ghidorah survives and brings about an apocalyptic event that spans the entire globe. Godzilla vs. Kong. Walter Simmons and Apex makes Mechagodzilla in order to replace Godzilla. It winds up going haywire and needs to be put down. You see the pattern? You don't mess with the monsters, like I said. The iwi know that. So even if they did want to expand their borders, they're not going to go around killing the monsters that would inevitably be attacking them. Which means they wouldn't go out and conquer, would they? See, this makes me wonder if Despot has even bothered watching the other movies, or if he's just jumping on the hate train for this movie. 'Cause he would know that if he had seen the other movies, or at least I assume he would. Based on those longer videos, he has no problem diving into excruciating detail about certain things. But to say this, that the iwi don't behave the way he would expect them to do, which would be out of character for them, and then saying that's a critique, well, it's not a good critique. I just have to come right out and say it. It's a complete non sequitur. It has nothing to do with actually critiquing the quality of the movie. Like I said, I didn't originally have any intention of responding to this thing, but if I had decided to respond to it on my own, the thing that would have gotten me was the way he treats the fans. One of my golden rules about being in the entertainment business is that you don't attack the fans. I don't like it when the Hollywood elites do it by calling audiences istophobic for not liking their terrible writing. I don't like it when people online do it, when people have a difference of opinion. I do my hardest not to do it when I'm having a discussion or when I'm making videos or anything. I have actually done my hardest to not attack Despot of Antrim here, even when I say that certain arguments don't necessarily feel like they paint a very good picture. I want to make it very clear, I can't prove that's what he actually thinks. But he, unfortunately, did not have the same level of respect for people who do like Godzilla, Kong, the New Empire. He basically assumes that fans of this movie are idiots. Idiots who just like the slop that Hollywood puts before them and will just gobble it up and pretend it's gourmet, all the while not realizing that they're just contributing to the problem. I just cannot abide by that. First of all, I know plenty of very intelligent people who happen to like Godzilla, Kong, the New Empire. And second, so what if people enjoy it? The thing is, the thing that really gets me about this particular part of Despot's video is that it's not like he's being a pretentious film snob who's just like, oh, well, you cannot have escapism. Your story has to have a deeper meaning or else it's all rubbish. It's not like that at all. He actually claims that he understands the appeal of watching a fun, turn-your-brain-off, campy movie because he likes Meg 2, The Trench. But he states that Meg 2 is genuinely fun, Godzilla x Kong is not fun. This is another one of those points where I would have to ask, how do you prove that? Everything he says against Godzilla x Kong, I guarantee you, somebody could make the exact same arguments about Meg 2, The Trench. So, if Despot and such a hypothetical person were to come into conflict about these two movies, they would ultimately be at an impasse, at least as far as I can tell. But moreover, shouldn't the fact that he likes The Trench mean he shouldn't be insulting the fans? It means... Look, if he's being genuine about that, and I have no reason to assume he's not, then I would expect him to say that maybe GXK wasn't fun for him, but given that he likes The Trench, he can at least understand how other people could have fun with it. But that's not what he said. He said, The Trench is good, The New Empire is bad. And again, this is one of those parts where I don't think he really properly quantified it. You know, personally, I don't think less of Despot for liking The Trench, because technically I agree with him. The Meg movies are fun escapism. Good old-fashioned creature features that you can just sit down and have fun with. Nothing like the original books, mind you, but, you know, still fun in their own right, despite themselves. I just don't understand why that's okay, but GXK isn't. It feels like it's kind of a double standard here. The slop that other people enjoy is bad, but if it's slop that Despot enjoys, that gets a pass. I can't reconcile that. And I especially can't reconcile it knowing how poorly he thinks of people who do enjoy the slop he doesn't like. I don't know, just... that's the part where I feel like any other point he might have had, even a good one, kind of falls apart because he crossed a line that I just don't think should ever be crossed. Like I said though, I don't fault him for liking The Trench. I don't really have any strong feelings about him at all. I just wish he hadn't crossed that line, you know? But that's about all I can really say about it, in terms of what I feel can actually be responded to. Again, this is just one section of a longer list video, so it was only going to have so much detail in it anyway. But in the long run, like I said, I'm getting used to people saying they don't like GXK. That's the popular thing to do. I think history will vindicate it as a nice little bit of campy fun, because if Godzilla vs. Megalon can have such a strong fan base in the modern day, anything can happen. But all the same, that's about all I have to say. Hopefully I earned my Patreon pay with this, but I'm really not sure what else I can do to respond to it. So, like I said, I have no personal grudge against Despot of Antrim. I don't think anybody really should, especially not over this, but what can you do otherwise? Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.